everyone, and welcome. I am Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for those joining us on the live stream. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that these past few weeks have been an immensely difficult time on Columbia's campus, and our focus here at SIPA, first and foremost, has been and will continue to be providing support to our students. It is vital, now I would say more than ever, that we will continue to fulfill our academic mission, including by holding this event today. So this afternoon, we will discuss two important topics. The first one is hostage diplomacy, and then we will discuss more the war in Ukraine. For our Across the Aisle on hostage diplomacy, and I hope by now you know the Across the Aisle speaker series, we've had several of those. This is something we're very proud of, bringing people from a with diverse perspective, points of views to talk about issues. So the first one will be this Across the Aisle. The topic will be, as I said, hostage diplomacy, and I'm delighted to welcome our bipartisan panel of U.S. diplomats and experts who will speak from experience about the importance of working across the aisle to bring wrongfully detained Americans home. This topic is, of course, especially relevant as authoritarian states like Russia, like Iran, like China, like North Korea and Venezuela have increasingly turned to arbitrary, unjustified detention as a tool of foreign policy. This discussion will also, of course, be pertinent to the current conflict in the Middle East. And so for that panel, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who I'm proud to say one of our IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellows. O'Brien served under President Trump as National Security Advisor and previously a Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. We also have Ambassador Roger Carstens, the current Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who served in Special Forces. We also are pleased to have with us Dr. Julia Nesheiwat, who Deputy and Acting Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs and former Deputy Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Resilience. We also have with us Sean Penn, an Academy Award-winning actor, filmmaker, and founder of CORE, a crisis response organization. And we have Jason Rezaian, an opinion columnist for the Washington Post, who was held for 544 days in the Iranian prison. And, of course, our very own Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, who needs really no introduction as our moderator today. I want to thank the Knight Foundation for making our signature Across the Aisle speaker series possible. This series, as I said, provides a forum for open, respectful dialogue across partisan and ideological divides, and an important model for our next generation of policymakers, and some of you are sitting here today. Now, following the Across the Aisle, we will have another IGP signature event, the Spotlight interview on the war in Ukraine with Ambassador O'Brien, with Sean Penn, and Secretary Hillary Clinton. This Spotlight interview could not be more timely, as you can imagine, given that Congress finally reached a deal on U.S. aid to Ukraine last week. And you may not know this, but Sean Penn co-directed a documentary called Superpower, which chronicles Ukrainian President Zelensky's path to office and his leadership in the first months of the Russian invasion. I highly recommend this documentary. Thank you for joining us today. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Well, I could not be more honored and delighted to be moderating this discussion with these really extraordinary panelists on an issue, as the Dean said, which is so relevant, so prominent, so difficult as the whole set of questions around hostages. So I'm going to get right into it because I want to give every one of them a chance to tell you their experience and begin to talk about what more needs to be done. So Sean, I'm going to start with you. Okay. I've known Sean a long time. I saw him in action in Haiti after the devastating earthquake. His commitment to solving problems and bringing people together is just absolutely extraordinary, and I'm very grateful to him. But before there was a special envoy for hostage negotiations, you actually took it upon yourself to get involved in rescuing an American from Bolivia. And tell us how you, as a private citizen, interacted with the United States government during that time, because that was before we had people like Ambassador O'Brien and Ambassador Carstens and Julie and others on the front lines.
Well, Jacob Ostreicher was a Brooklyn, New York resident who had gone to start a rice concession in Bolivia. It was very productive. And Bolivia had at the time within its judiciary a group that's referred to as the Red, which were sort of a mafia, a narco mafia. And it was not a completely unusual case where they seized Jacob's land and charged him with narco trafficking and money laundering. The story came to me sort of strangely through another actor who had engaged in some charity work with some of the rabbis who Jacob was close to here in New York, and they had known that I had some connection with President Chavez in Venezuela, and that he would have some influence with President Morales in Bolivia. So, but in fact, out of the work with Haiti, I had spent some time just before that with President Morales and had a good interaction. And so I was able to call him and go down and first talking to people here, talking to the FBI and the State Department to find out, to have some confidence that Jacob was in fact innocent of the charges. And that was unambiguously the case. He was innocent. And it became about 2 years of going back and forth between La Paz and Santa Cruz, where he was in prison, Palma Sola prison, visiting him, seeing his health degrading. He was on hunger strike, and going to the court. And the courts in Bolivia were, I would say, a more over-the-top version of what you would see in Midnight Express. People were literally twirling their mustaches and lying flat out, and the judge was constantly favoring the BS. It really looked like a skit. It was so over the top. And so I started to talk to, I noticed that because, especially in these, and this is probably where I come in, I'll try to get fast to the people who have so much depth of experience in this, but there's a syndrome that's sort of a David and Goliath, where with some of the more populist governments, the opportunity to defy the United States is sometimes too tempting to resist. And so when there's pressure from the State Department or others, they will make their public aware of the pressure that's on and use it as an opportunity to defy. So this is where someone, a private citizen, maybe can come in, where I tried very hard through all legal routes. Ultimately, through some operators who I had met initially in my time in Haiti, who were now in the former operator status, there was a trip down to ask Jacob if he wanted to go home by any means. And I had a translator with me who was doing some logistics mapping and so on, strategizing. And I asked him quietly if he wanted to get out, and eventually, at first he wanted to fight for his money back. He was trying, but he saw that those courts were not working in his favor. So then the question, because we had extradition with Bolivia, was to call someone senior here and say what would happen if he got overland out of Bolivia. And they said that they would find a humanitarian parole for him, and he would not be sent back. And so we had a very, very tense day, but ultimately he was extracted and brought back to the United States. But I think that the main event of that is really just that sort of the personality of some of this, because the United States is, you know, the best one to defy if you want to look like a tough guy.
You know, Sean, that's like another movie that you just described in terms of the intense negotiations and the eventual outcome. And it's understandable then that the United States government decided that there had to be some more organized way of dealing with Americans who had been unjustly imprisoned, kidnapped, held against their will. And I want to turn to Julia, because Julia was at the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the U.S. Department of State in the very earliest days. And this was a new idea, wasn't it, Julia? There had not been an office like that, although there certainly had been U.S. government efforts in the past. And you were there with Jim O'Brien, who was also charged with getting it set up and trying to prioritize hostage recoveries. Can you tell us about that time, some of the challenges you faced, and how you began to get both the mission and the office on firmer ground?
Yes, thank you, Madam Secretary. That's exactly right. It was, you know, in a moment, I was just a civil servant at the time at the State Department, and all of you may have remembered back in 2011 and 2012, there was this uptick of ISIS in the Middle East taking a number of hostages and unfortunately doing these public executions and beheadings and so forth. And so it was a situation where, while we had the portfolio within the US government to look at these types of cases, whether it's a hostage case or a wrongful detention case, which we'll probably talk a little bit more about, there wasn't really a centralized focal point for that. Where did families go when their loved one was taken? Do you go to the embassy? Do you go, if there is one, do you go to the State Department Consular Affairs, the Regional Bureau, the FBI? It was really scattered in different areas, even though there was obviously great men and women working these issues. So the creation of the SPIHA office, we love acronyms, which was created in the late summer of 2015 after there was a one-year policy review of these situations, what was going on. We worked very closely with the families. Many of you know Diane Foley, mother of Jim Foley, who's done tremendous work in advocacy. So when we were asked at the time to build this new office, there was the PPD 30, Presidential Policy Directive 30, and I won't go into all the nuances of that, but this new presidential directive allowed the creation of the SPIHA office, the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, as well as a hostage recovery group at the National Security Council. So Jim and I at the State Department, it was literally just him and I in the beginning, and we were given this little, I'd say, and Robert's been there, this kind of a little bit of like a dungeon in the basement of a SCIF, which is a classified area, with a couple desks. You've got like dust on the ceilings. I mean, it wasn't anything glamorous whatsoever. And we
felt like we were hostages ourselves.
Yes, Exactly, and so you're building this office. You're looking at the cases at hand. I mean, the cases worldwide. I won't go into the numbers. Getting staffing, getting that kind of support, and then there's the culture of it all. So you talk about some of the challenges. When you're a new office, it takes time to build those bridges, if you will. And so for some of you who may not know, we have what's called regional bureaus at the State Department. And a lot of times they will set the agenda, they will set the priorities. And one of the challenges I found was hostages would always kind of be at the end of that list. I mean, understandably, there's trade issues, there's arms control, there's counterterrorism, but where were the hostage cases and where was that elevated? So our office would fight and push to get those cases elevated. If the Secretary of State was meeting with a foreign minister or a head of state, we would have that direct line. And I think that was what's key to that office, is having that direct line to the Secretary of State and also to the White House. So that was one area. The other one, when it comes to culture, I don't think a lot of civil servants, public servants understood with this new role and this directive, while we don't advertise it, we had the authority to negotiate with terrorists, with rogue nations, obviously doing this in a very coordinated way with our, what we call interagency, all the departments and agencies. So there was this notion of, do we talk to terrorists, do we not? Also, other variables were working with the families. That was something that wasn't really heard of before, but we treated them like partners in that process. And then the other aspect, a lot of these hostages are journalists, are aid workers, so we worked also with the media, and that was a very important piece of that too. They would have valuable information, or we'd coordinate on what needs to go out, what doesn't need to go out. So it was, again, very unique to this office that some of these roles were not, not everyone was used to doing that. And especially even with our colleagues at the Bureau, it was all about what are the facts, ma'am, and that was it. So I think with this creation, with the Presidential Policy Directive 30, we persevered. We built a staff. I'm proud to say that now Roger leading the charge. But we did have a little bit of a gap, so I did serve as acting for quite some time until Robert was able to join and spearhead and help elevate the issues as much as possible. So big thanks to you, Robert, for all of that, and it was an honor to serve also as your deputy. So thank you.
Well, I want to turn to Robert because he did succeed Jim O'Brien, and
yes.
His last name is O'Brien, so
no relation.
No relation.
You had to be an O'Brien to get the job, though.
Yes, absolutely.
Kind of a bit of a pattern for at least the two of them. And I think it's fair to say, Robert, that this office was not all that well known. It was, as Julia said, just getting underway. And now I think it is also fair to say it is an extremely well-known position within the United States government, to which I give Julia and Jim O'Brien and you and Roger and others a lot of credit because of the way you've handled the challenges you face. And it is a very fraught assignment. The families, the people you're dealing with, it's just incredibly challenging. So tell us a little bit, Robert, about your going in and what you saw as the mission and how you tried to really build up both the credibility and the impact of the office.
Well, thank you, Secretary Clinton. The first thing I did is I kept Julia as my deputy, so that was my best move. She was used to working for an O'Brien, so she knew the Irish. So that was a key thing because Julia kept the office alive for about a year. So I'd been appointed, but it was about a 6-month period before I could get my security clearance and get to the State Department. And then once we sat down in this little, 2-desk office, and it was Julia, myself, and the secretary, we had to figure out what do we do. And so we did a couple of things just off the bat. The first thing, I got a spreadsheet of all the hostages and wrongful detainees. And I thought, this is really impersonal. And so I said to Julia and our staffer, make baseball cards. I wanted a picture of the hostage. I wanted to know where they were from, who their congressman was, who their senator was, who was fighting for them, where they were captured, what date they were captured on. And I carried those, we had about 40, 45 baseball cards to start with. I carried those around in my pocket all day long. So anytime I was in a meeting and someone asked what I did, I'd pull out the baseball cards and said, my job is to get these people home. And so I thought that was important. The second thing we did is we changed, there was a memo, and Roger, I don't know if it's still there, that described what the office does. And the first thing on the memo, it said, we use diplomacy to get our hostages out, and we only use military force as a last resort. And I changed the memo. I said, we're going to use military resources as our first resort to rescue hostages, And only after that fails will we use diplomacy. Now that created a little bit of a ruckus in the State Department, as you can imagine. But I thought it was important. The reason we have Delta Force, the reason we have SEAL Team 6, those organizations, special forces, were created after the Iran hostage crisis back in the 80s to rescue our hostages. And once we changed that and we let the bad guys know where we were coming from, we had 2 very successful rescues quite early on. They weren't with American forces. The first one was Danny Birch, an oil worker in Yemen, who the UAE Special Forces got out. And the second was a woman who's, we can't mention her name because she doesn't want her name mentioned, but she was an American woman who was rescued in the Sahel in, I think, Mali by French Marines. And in that case, 2 French Marines were actually killed rescuing her. They were killed in the little hut she was in, because the SOP for the hostages in a rescue is to kill the hostage first for the hostage takers. They kill the hostage to try and deter future rescue operations. So these 2 French Marines had gone into this little encampment, and we're in a gunfight. And unfortunately, because of the way they parachuted in, they didn't have plates, they didn't have their armor on, and they took shots to the chest, but they also killed the hostage takers and rescued the hostages. So the word started getting out, and then we had a number of very successful operations using our special forces in Afghanistan. So the word started getting out that we weren't playing around, and that helped our diplomacy, because once foreign governments understood that we had capabilities, and the hostage takers knew that we had capabilities to rescue hostages, then they wanted to talk. And so that leads kind of the next thing we did is, Julia mentioned it, there's something in the State Department called the clearance process. And the clearance process is a death knell of anything you want to get done. So if you want to get something done in the State Department, it's got to be cleared by all these people, by all the regional bureaus and functional bureaus and the political undersecretary and the deputy secretary, and sometimes it even goes up to the Secretary of State. So by the time you get the clearance done, it's like a year later, and whatever initiative we work on doesn't get done. So I took the position that I was the title is Special Presidential Envoy. There are a lot of envoys, there are a lot of coordinators, there are a lot of czars in the U.S. government. There are very few presidential envoys. There have been very few in history, probably less than 30 or 40. So I took the position that the only person who cleared on my operations, and Julia was helping with, was the President and the Secretary of State. Now, the rest of the State Department went berserk over that, but I took the position, go call Mike Pompeo if you don't like it. And if he clears it and you don't like it, go to the 7th floor and go get an appointment with him, which first of all is impossible. And then we're not going to clear anything. And so then the bureaucracy decided, well, we're not going to pay for your flights. Unless you clear, we're not going to pay for your flights. I said, that's fine. I'll use my American Express card. I started paying for my own flights. So I was flying all around the world doing these negotiations on my own dime. My wife, Loma, supported it, which I appreciate. And then they didn't know what to do, because I was flying. I had a black passport. I didn't take staff with me. I'd hop on an Air Algeria flight and end up in Algiers or Doha or Riyadh or somewhere, and the bureaucracy didn't quite know what to do with it. But we started getting a lot of people home, and that built on itself. And I think we handed off. I had a great deputy, and I picked a great successor in Roger Carstens. So I figured I was kind of the bridge between Jim O'Brien getting it started, me elevating the position. It didn't hurt that I became National Security Advisor, because in Washington, everyone's always trying to get the next job. It's a Washington thing for those of you who have been in Washington. So all of a sudden, it had a little cachet that the Spiha became the National Security Advisor. That was a total accidental situation, but it happened, and I think they gave us some prestige, and I handed it off to Roger, and he's busy breaking all our records and getting a lot of people home, which we appreciate. So.
I love your description of the bureaucracy. Oh my gosh, yes. You really just bulldozed right through it, Robert, which I admire, and got to.
I didn't make a lot of friends, Secretary. You can imagine. I wasn't very popular in the building.
Yeah. It's all right. You got a lot done, and I think that's what really matters, because these cases, as you have already heard. And when Julia said, they often end up on the bottom of the list of what people are negotiating about or concerned about. And it's not out of any indifference or neglect. It's just hard to get one person's fate elevated to where it needs to be. And so it's really important that these negotiators keep that in mind with the baseball cards, with the names, with the stories. And Roger, you I think are the only politically appointed official who worked for both President Trump and President Biden, which shows you your negotiating skills are quite remarkable. And you have brought so many Americans home under both administrations, because once the office was established under the Obama administration, every president has really tried to support what went on in that office and to give you, the envoy, the support that you needed. So tell us a little bit about your getting into the job. It was already mentioned that you came out of Special Forces, so you had a military, not a diplomatic background. How'd you find yourself in this position, and then how did you begin to try to deal with the large numbers of people that were out there?
Madam Secretary, thanks for that question. And by the way, thank you for getting us together to talk about what I think is a very important topic, and that is, finding ways to work across the aisle to solve some of these big problems. So thank you for that. Madam Dean, I'd like to thank you also, Columbia, SIPA, IGP, and also the Knight Foundation, but also all these people on this panel who are good friends of mine. I think Jason and I have known each other since I took this job. And I think, of course, Robert and Julie and I have worked together. Sean and I have exchanged emails and notes and texts and some very strange and pretty important and powerful situations. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be up here with all of you, and grateful for your attention. So to jump into the question, I just finished running an NGO in Amman, Jordan. It was an NGO that was based in Amman, but we were putting food parcels into southern Syria and doing some other things to help Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons. And after about a year and a half in Amman, I came back to the United States. I felt it was time to reconnect with my family. And in doing so, I talked to, frankly, a West Point classmate of mine by the name of Mike Pompeo, and asked him if he needed any help. And he gave me my first pick, and I went straight to democracy, human rights, and labor. It's called DRL. It's in the Department of State, and probably one of the most fulfilling jobs I've ever had, working with the team in DRL to promote human rights around the world. And after about a year, I was pretty, as they say, very happy in my work. And Secretary Pompeo asked me to move over to take the SPIHA role. And I didn't really know much about SPIHA at that time. So I did a little research and called him right back and said, yes, sir, I'll take the role, and went right into it. And I think as Robert and Julia said, it was still, it felt like the wild, wild west. It felt like a time of pirates, where you had to take huge risks to get things done. And it's the way it had to be, but I thought if this job and this role is going to survive, we have to solidify it and institutionalize it. And we started to look at the things that are common within the administrations and maybe directions we have to go. Now, here's what we knew. As a starting premise, we knew that every president supports this effort. President Obama is the reason that the government version of the hostage recovery enterprise exists. He did a hostage policy review after some mistakes that the US government made in Syria. He made some hard decisions, and he was willing to change the dynamic and change how we do this business. So we have to thank President Obama for his leadership, and Jim O'Brien and Julia for getting the office up and running. President Trump cared about this topic. As you can tell by Robert's incredible numbers in bringing Americans home, he had the support of the President and the Secretary of State. And I think the same is definitely true with the current leadership team. I can tell you that President Biden carries this in his heart, and whether it's Gaza, whether it's Evan Gershkovich in Russia, whether it's those who are held in Afghanistan, President Biden knows what's going on about these. He cares deeply about this topic. And I see some nodding heads out there from some people that I'm working with currently. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken, he carries a little 3x5 card in his pocket right here with every single person that he's brought back and every single person that remains on this list with whom I'm charged with bringing home. So that was the common factor that allowed us to, in a way, kind of push ahead and start working the resource battle. I think in my mind, there was a time when I could only think 24 hours ahead of time because the crush of the families, the caseload, trying to negotiate within the interagency. And I think over a period of 2 years, we were able to staff up to 25 people. We were able to work out lines of effort that allowed people to focus on their mission sets. We were able to garner some office space, some pretty sweet real estate, by the way, the State Department.
That's his biggest negotiation win, is getting the real
Right
estate
there.
in the State Department. That was huge.
Yeah.
I don't know how you did that because I couldn't get it. I got hostage home. I couldn't get the real estate and the office space. So.
Madam Secretary, you were commenting about that, how real estate's pretty big at state. Well, we got a beautiful place. Come visit us if you get to D.C. But we were able to work on trying to get the resourcing, and then the people on Capitol Hill stepped in. Members of both parties pulled together. In 2020, they passed the Robert A. Levinson Act, and that Levinson Act, you could say, wrote into law what we were trying to do. It institutionalized what President Obama had done with the PPD and also the executive order from 2015, but also started to move towards resourcing. A recent amendment, for example, has provided us not only with the budget line, but the appropriation, the money to go with it. And we've worked hard to establish those bank accounts and try to figure out how we can take what Congress has given us, that being criteria with which to identify who's wrongfully detained, and that's been extremely helpful for us. It kind of lines out who does what within the US government. That was also huge. It gives us a sanctioning authority if we ever want to throw a governmental lightning bolt to someone who's actually been tough on us or taking too many of our people, for example. So Congress has been a wonderful partner in this, Republicans and Democrats. If you don't believe me, go take a look at some of the recent work that's come out of Congress, say a resolution on Ryan Corbett. If you take a look at who's been signing that, who's been co-sponsoring, I see my good friend Mike, who I'm going to refer to you later on anyway. But this is something that both sides of the party can get behind, and it's allowed us to go from SPIHA 1.0 to 2.0 to currently 3.0. And of course, we're working with members on Capitol Hill. I would say organizations that are outside, nonprofits, people like Jason, empowered individuals, partners and allies around the world to determine how we grow this enterprise out and then eventually come up with a deterrence strategy that in the next 10 to 15 years will hopefully make a lot of this problem go away.
Well, I want to get back to you about the deterrence strategy because I think obviously that's something that we all need to understand better. But I want to turn to Jason because, as you heard in the introduction, Jason was imprisoned in Iran for 500 plus days. And so his perspective as someone who was unjustly seized and imprisoned, I think it would be great to share that, Jason. What did you know when you were inside? What did your captors tell you? Because part of the sad interactions are what captors do to try to make prisoners feel, hostages feel that nobody cares about them, nobody's thinking about them, nobody's talking about them, that they ought to just submit, they ought to give false confessions, whatever they're trying to make you do. And so that whole perspective from your unique experience, I think, really adds to how hard this work is.
Thank you for the question, Madam Secretary. Thanks everybody for being here. It's a very important issue. Robert and I talk often about this being maybe the last bipartisan issue, and I think that that's really true, and this group is an indication of that. At the time that I was arrested, I was the bureau chief for the Washington Post in Tehran. My wife, an Iranian native, also a journalist, we represented a big chunk of the English language international press in Iran. We were seized, abducted from our home, blindfolded, handcuffed, and taken off to Evin prison, which some of you may have heard of before, considered one of the most notorious prisons in the world. Happened to be about a 2-mile drive from where we lived in Tehran. And we were deposited immediately in solitary confinement, both of us, separate. Had no idea of her whereabouts for well over a month. And during those initial weeks of solitary confinement, I would be shuttled from my cell that was about 4 by 8 feet with fluorescent lights on 24 hours a day, back and forth to an interrogation room. That was it. And from day one, it was, we know you're the CIA station chief, the Washington Post doesn't exist. I mean, just ridiculous, claims to break you down. The idea is to wear you down into a malleable piece of meat. And it works quite well. Fortunately, I worked for a big news organization in the center of Washington, D.C. And our publisher had been President Reagan's last chief of staff. So he felt entitled to reach out to President Obama's chief of staff. And they opened up a dialogue quite quickly. I'll say this, I was sort of in the best case scenario of hostages, working for a big news organization, a lot of attention on my case, and it still took 1.5 years to get me home. I think when you look at so many of these cases, people in our small community of victims of this come home, they say to themselves, wow, I wish my case got resolved like Jason's did. And I've always believed that we could do a lot better than that, right? Which is why I think that not only this office of SPIHA is so important, just awareness around the issue. And I wanted to mention something that Sean said about this sort of David and Goliath thing, right? There's another David and Goliath situation in these scenarios with the actual hostage. And I think this is why it's such an important issue. The abuse of power, especially when it comes to a wrongful detention by a state. You are being held simply because you're a US citizen and have potential value in negotiations with your captor state. And in taking you, they are mobilizing all of the resources available to them against you. It's their law enforcement, their intelligence services, their judiciary, their parliament, their diplomats, their executive branch, their propaganda networks, all designed to destroy you and everything dear to you because you're American. In a strange way, it's not personal, but the effects on your life and your community and your friendships, your family relationships are deeply personal. It's over 8 years since I was released, and we still feel the effects of that in our family every single day, which is why when I came out, I got very dedicated to elevating this issue as much as possible. Known Julia, Robert, Roger for quite a long time. And we've had lots and lots of conversations in informal and formal ways. And I recognize a community of people in and out of government starting to realize what a big deal this is, what a big problem it is. And to your point, Madam Secretary, about deterrence, that currently, and I'll be real honest about this, there's, you hear a lot that doesn't doing a deal to release a hostage incentivize more hostage taking? Honestly, I think that's an irrelevant question. The question is, what are we doing to make it less attractive? Yeah. And the fact is, so far, our government, other Western governments haven't figured out a formula to stand in the way. So I'm really hopeful that through the work that SPIHA office is doing in the National Security Council, other hostage units within the government, but also outside of government. I'm very proud to have Robert O'Brien co-chairing a commission at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., along with Senator Shaheen. Very bipartisan effort to look at these issues and see how we can make a difference moving forward. Because I believe this isn't a fate that anybody should have to suffer, and one that, we're in the United States of America, we put people on the moon, right? We can figure this one out too.
Well, I think that's a great way to segue into asking everybody on the panel about, what they would like to see going forward, and tackle some of the difficult problems. Sometimes it's very useful to publicize the fate of a hostage. Sometimes you're told, don't say a word about it. Yeah. How do you make those difficult judgments? Because in a number of cases that I have personal knowledge of, talking about the hostage, challenging the government that took the hostage, gave great heart, both to the hostage, if they ever heard about it, but also for their family. But it could also, and there's been some reporting on this, cause the government or the terrorist group or whoever's holding the hostage just to hang on even longer to the person. So, making those judgment calls is almost a literally hour by hour sort of calculation. So Julia, I want to turn to you first, because you were at the beginning of this effort. You've had a lot of really great experiences. You too were in the military. You too have served as a diplomat. You've served in Afghanistan and other places. Having now a little bit of distance from your initial work setting up the office, what are some of the lessons that you think we've learned, but what are some of the challenges that we really still need to address?
No, thank you very much, Madam Secretary. It has taken me a while to kind of reflect and decompress, thinking, what could we have done better, what could we do to improve, and so forth. While I look at it two parts. One, we did have discussions, although we never really were able to enforce it, was how to help American citizens in particular from a preventative standpoint. How can we encourage Americans to not travel, for example, to these dangerous places and so forth? And now we obviously can't control everything, but what are the resources available besides just putting a travel advisory out there? But listening to Sean and to Roger and even and Jason, to me, the biggest impact would be the deterrence aspect of this, where if there is a rogue nation or a terror group, that they would think twice before taking an American hostage or wrongfully detained. Right now, unfortunately, there's only an upside. There is no downside. They continue to politicize the situation, to use Americans as these political pawns. And so, if there was a silver bullet answer, I wish I would say that today, but unfortunately there isn't. But we've got to think of creative ways that we can continue to deter these individuals. That if they realize it's an American, you know what? There's too much downside here. We're not gonna even bother, and that there will be some sort of impact, whether it's economically, whether it's diplomatically, and even militarily. I think it's important because, as Jason said, this cycle will continue on. You get a hostage released, but then they pick up another one, and so where does that end, other than the incentives behind it? So, to me, that's been the biggest takeaway of how we can really build upon. Yes, the preventative aspect of that, more resources to assist Americans and having that knowledge and awareness, but truly the impact of having a deterrence piece of that amplified would go a long way.
I do think, though, that first point you made about trying to warn Americans not to put themselves in harm's way cannot be repeated enough, because it is something that we've seen time and time again, totally innocently in most cases. Somebody ends up where they shouldn't be. But Robert, I wanted to ask you, because you were in the unique position of being involved in hostage and wrongful detainee cases, both when you were the special envoy, but also when you were the national security advisor. And what role should a president play? I mean, I think we've established that the commitment to doing something to help get people released is totally bipartisan. Each president has demonstrated their commitment. But it's a tough call when you get a president involved. So we had some really high-profile cases. Evan's already been mentioned. It's just an absolute outrage that he is still imprisoned in Russia. Brittany Griner, Pastor Brunson, even ASAP Rocky, which I know you had something to do with. So talk a little bit about when the envoy needs to go to the White House to basically say this has to be elevated to the highest level.
So the first thing I'll say, Secretary, is when Roger was envoy and I was National Security Advisor, everyone he got home I took credit for, because so I got kind of a twofer there. But look, it's a hard question because, and this, you mentioned this and Julia mentioned it, Jason alluded to it. If the president gets too involved, the price tag can go up, right? So, Brittany Griner is a classic case where they took someone who they believed was important to President Biden's base. I mean, they already had American hostages, but they got an African-American woman who's lesbian, played in the WNBA, and they thought that would put a lot of pressure. Putin's a very savvy guy. They selected her because they thought that would put a lot of pressure on Biden, and it did. And they got him actively involved. And Roger did a great job getting her home. So these are very targeted things. So let me just mention something about the nation states, because every terrorist organization is different. Every wrongful detention is different. But there's some things we have in common. So what we're now starting to see is the Russians and Chinese want to see a hostage exchange. They want to get their prisoners out in return for ours. Now the problem is we don't play their game. So we don't pick up Chinese spies. We let Chinese spies get away. So we've had a whole series, and the Wall Street Journal has reported on this, of Chinese nationals who drive onto military bases, ram through the barriers, drive onto the base until they're caught by the police. The police pick them up. The U.S. Attorney, the Department of Justice says, well, it's a misdemeanor trespass. We're going to slap you on the wrist and let you go. We need to collect all those Chinese trespassers, or let's face it, they're spies. And the Chinese now have 30 to 40 Americans that the Chinese are a little more savvy on the hostage front than we are. They sit there, they've got exit bans on them. So they won't let them leave China, but they're not actually in jail. So they don't put them in an Evan prison situation like Rezaian was in, but they put them in, they may be at the Hyatt Hotel, but they can't leave China. Well, if we round up all the Chinese spies that we know are here and are legitimate spies and are a legitimate target and have broken our law and picked them up and said, okay, if you want them back, you got to exchange them for an American. That's how you start, deterring the Chinese from taking these spies. Same thing with the Russians. The Russian mafia is very connected to the Russian government. And we've got Russian organized crime all over America. If we got serious and wanted our people back, we'd start cracking down on Russian organized crime. They've got connections to the KGB and to the Russian hierarchy and the oligarchs. You take them, you put them in prison, and they say, okay, we want Evan Gershkovich back, or we want Paul Whelan back, or any of our other hostages, and you start doing trades. So once there's a downside, because Julia's absolutely right, there's no downside to these governments now because we don't play their game. I don't like it, and I'm not suggesting ever that America does what they do, where we take an innocent Russian or an innocent Chinese national and trade them back. But if we know they're spies or we know they're criminals, let's pick them up, and then let's use those as currency to get our people back. And once that happens, then they're going to realize, wait a minute, there's no upside to this game, and maybe they'll stop. On the hostage front for the non-state actors, the JNIMs and the Al-Qaedas and the ISIS of the world, of Hamas, I think some of them Hamas hasn't been because we don't treat them like we treat them like an NGO instead of a hostage organization. But for the other hostage organizations, they got the message, I think, with the military rescues, and they decided after Walton was rescued in Nigeria, and all the hostage takers died, and we got him out safely. They started realizing that the risk is too high to take an American hostage. Let's take a French or an Italian or someone else, but not take an American because guys like Mike Waltz or Roger Carstens or Julia are going to come get them. And all those situations are different, but we have to somehow figure out how to disincentivize people from taking Americans. And right now, there's no disincentive. It's a free, you get a free pass.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add one little thing, and I think Robert alluded to the fact that differentiating between terrorist organizations and state, obviously very, very important, but you also have to differentiate from state to state. Yeah. And I think that the deterrence, or at least the beginning of the roadmap to deterrence, is baked into the motivation, right? It's sort of a mirror image. What motivates this actor to do this? Let's nip that in the bud earlier on. So with Iran, it's money. With China and Russia, it's people.
It's Roger, what is your assessment of the progress we've made, but the challenges we still face?
Madam Secretary, I'll jump on the deterrence wagon if I may. So about 2 years ago, maybe almost 3 now, Secretary Blinken caught me in the hallway and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, work on the deterrence effort, let's make this problem go away. And we've been running with that ever since. We've been working with the Canadians off something that they did, where they put out something called the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations. So far, 75 countries in the EU have signed on to that. But the Secretary wanted us to work on something that might have more teeth, something where we could build a coalition of countries that were willing to take action. I have 2 people in my office who do nothing but that. They work full-time on deterrence. We've met with numerous countries all around the world to bring them on to a tighter coalition. And what we tell them is the end state is one day someone's going to take a citizen from Kenya or Belgium or Sweden or Japan, and that country will call upon other countries, to include us, and we'll go ahead and go to the hostage taker, be it Iran, Russia, fill in the blank, and we'll level a bunch of costs that make this an unbearable practice for those countries to continue doing. I'm hoping to get to one point where the Iranians say, they figured out what our game plan is, we're going to have to switch to something else like, maybe diplomacy. Maybe that's how we'll solve our problems with America, as opposed to taking people. And to that end, we've been working with members on Capitol Hill, members in the interagency, to identify the tools that America can bring to bear across all elements of our national power. So not just a sanctioning tool, not just a démarche in the diplomacy field, but what can we do in the information space, the military space, the economic space, the intelligence space, financial, law enforcement? What can we do across the board to build up a toolkit that we can use in the right case at the right time to elevate our game? And we're trying to encourage our allies and partners around the world to do the same. I probably spend about 30 to 40% of my time on the road. And I would say of that, 50% is towards negotiating for the return of Americans. The other half of that is on building this coalition. Now, the secretary, when he said this, he goes, Roger, this will get done 2 or 3 secretaries of state after me. It may be a 10-year solution to build up that coalition and develop the tools, but we're dead serious about getting it to the point where I actually get to dismantle part of my office, and we can go ahead and have new tools to stop this forever.
Well, that's an interesting scenario, looking out 10 years or so to try to get there. In the meantime, you have to keep dealing
Exactly.
with everything that is sent your way. And Sean, you've developed quite a personal relationship with Robert, and have worked with and talked with, been on programs with him. And so you've seen it from your own experience of trying to get someone out of Bolivia, but you've also seen it sort of secondhand, vicariously, about what the government's doing. What are your views about, what could we do more? How could we try to have better deterrence, quicker recovery? Any observations on that?
Well, the first thing is I've been noticing while in this room how significant I am to this panel, because I realize, okay, Jesse Jackson was running around helping me. The former governor of New Mexico was counted on quite a bit, and then it was Sean Penn. We better create an office. And one of the things when Robert and I got together initially, related to Austin Tice. And he came out, so we sat down. And one of the things that I was taken by, and it's an important part of this because it is such a almost partisan subject. This is just a human thing that we can, as Jason said, bridge on so much. It has such symbolic strength. And yet within that office, there is also that ability to have a very human touch on the families. And I saw that with Robert, his investment in all of the families, and in fact, just it happened to be that 2 nights ago in Washington, D.C., I was at an event, and an older woman came up to me and introduced herself, and it was Deborah Tice, and talked about how important to their family Robert had been in his time, in trying to get the release of Austin. Now, in answer to the question, the one thing I think maybe is particular to my experience, and I know that it doesn't connect with all of these situations. I certainly wouldn't think it would apply, let's say, with Putin. But I did see, especially in a couple of cases related to South American leaderships, that there could be an extension of a kind of all-hands manners period. Sometimes the expressions of respect from the U.S. or from the President of the United States go a very long way. I know of one case where a head of state who I knew had had a handshake from President Obama, and I saw a 5-day period where everything could have been healed, a public handshake. And so I think that in times when these things are in sensitive negotiation, that if this office had broad support in all Americans, avoiding an arrogance and speaking with respect, with whatever areas of respect they could, during that period of time, there'd be more successful negotiations.
Well, I agree with that. We're going to give Jason the last word, but it is the SPEHA, the Sean Penn Envoy Hostage Affairs. I don't think that acronym is by accident. So, Jason, I know you mentioned this group that you're involved in at CSIS, along with Senator Jeanne Shaheen, and I assume you're looking at deterrence, you're looking at things that might make a difference. Can you kind of give us a preview or give us your own thoughts about what best we could do to try to limit this problem and deal with it more effectively?
So the game plan is to make recommendations to whoever becomes president next January. Fortunately, we have secured some funding that'll allow us to do that again in 2029. But you know, we've brought together a group of folks who run the gamut: former law enforcement, former diplomats, current Senate staffer, journalists, former hostages, family members, to look at this from all sides of the equation. And you know, when I first met Robert, he reached out to me, having had read my book on a flight, I think, and we started up a fast friendship after that. Roger helped me get out of a jam with the IRS, because when you're wrongfully detained on the other side of the world, the IRS doesn't stop charging you.
You can't make that up.
It's
either.
not. It's a true story. Both of these men, in their capacity, and Robert as National Security Advisor, made calls to the IRS, and we were able to get it down, but not all the way. So Senator Coons introduced some legislation last year that hopefully will make that impossible moving forward. Unfortunately, not retroactively for the Rezaians, but you know, life goes on. But you know, I think bringing together people to look at all aspects of this issue and make honest recommendations that will, I think, be an addition to PPD 30 and the Levinson Act, right? This is not a static issue. It's also not a new one. It's affected civilization for thousands of years. Roger, who has a degree in the classics, can tell us all about the many thousands of years of hostages being taken by states as leverage. And I truly believe that we can make a dent in this, but it's going to require commitment, resources, and interest from both sides of the aisle, but also from the public. And for better or worse, dozens of members of Congress have now had to deal with this. When I came out, it was just a handful of people, right? And I think there's networks of people that are coalescing in and around the halls of power, and I just hope that the lines of communication remain open no matter what, because no family should have to suffer this fate.
Amen to that, and I just can't thank the panel enough. You know, when Robert came as an IGP fellow, the very first thing he told us is he wanted to focus on hostage recovery and the whole set of issues you've just heard about around the taking of hostages. And we're so grateful that you did. That is really a great debt. Thank you so much, Robert, because as Jason just said, more people need to know about this, more people need to understand it, they need to study it, and we need to be behind those trying to do more to prevent it, to deter it, and to get people home. So please join me in thanking the panel.
Good to see you. Thank you.
So this was our across the aisle panel. Now we're going to have a spotlight interview with Robert and Sean about Ukraine. So that's coming right up.
Great.
Madam Secretary, thank you. Wonderful. Very grateful.
See you.
That's great. That's terrific.
You know, but it's an issue that we would not have covered without.
No, but you've been willing to be here, and you're in the draw.
Well, thank you all very, very much, and please join us when you get something to eat. And we have some really interesting observations from our two guests here. As you heard in their introductions, Ambassador O'Brien had a unique experience both as the special envoy for hostage work, but also then as the national security advisor in the Trump administration, where he did a lot of really groundbreaking work, the Abraham Accords, some of the NATO defense spending increases, and a lot of other important matters. And as the NSA through 2020, was certainly privy to a lot of the intelligence, both classified and open source, about Russia's intentions and Russia's capabilities. And so I couldn't be happier that as one of our IGP fellows, he could be here both for the important hostage discussion and now to talk about Ukraine. I wanted to start with you, Robert. Finally there was action taken, and I know that you were actively involved in speaking with members, Republican members particularly of Congress, talking about how they could, structure aid for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan, how they could bring it to a vote. And it was bipartisan, and I think that's something that is really critically important. Once this provision got on the floor, first in the Senate, there was a bipartisan vote for it, and then when Speaker Johnson, with, I think, great political peril to himself, brought it to the floor of the House. Again, it passed overwhelmingly. So there has been a decision made by our Congress to continue to provide aid. What is the significance of that, and how do you see the state of the conflict right now, and how will this aid and whatever else we and Europeans and others can do to help Ukraine deal with the very persistent, vicious assault by the Russians?
Yeah, so thank you, Hillary. And one of the things you left out is I worked for you as well back in the day.
Back in the day.
In Afghanistan, which is a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I worked for Secretary Rice, and Secretary Clinton came on, kind of like Roger Carstens, held me over for a couple months to help out in Afghanistan. It was an honor. Look, the issue with Ukraine is very important because it hasn't been a thing. I'll put my international lawyer hat on. I was a lawyer before becoming a diplomat and policy guy. We ended this idea that you could conquer your neighbor and gain good title to a territory through conquest back after World War I. It was kind of became a thing again in World War II when the Italians and the Germans tried to do it and the Japanese tried to do it. But the idea that a bigger neighbor could just conquer the smaller neighbor because it had the military might or the economic might or the population, that's something that became kind of verboten in international law. You just couldn't conquer your neighbor. Because if you had that kind of a situation going, the world would be a very dangerous place. It would be the law of the jungle. And so just putting aside the politics of it, if you're, from an international law point of view, the idea that you can invade, and that's the whole point of the UN Charter, was to stop member states from invading each other. And so it was the right thing to do to support Ukraine when they were invaded by Russia. Putin is a bad guy. I mean, I've met Putin. He's savvy. He's a tough guy. He's very cordial. I mean, he was a KGB case officer, so his job was to convince people to betray their country and give their country secrets. So you have to be charming. You have to be a salesperson to do that. But underneath Putin, he's not a good person. And his goal was to subjugate the people of Ukraine and take over the country and maybe carve off a little part of it around Lviv and give it to the Poles, but to destroy the country of Ukraine. And so we had to stop that. Now, policy differences between the parties on the best way to do it. One of the things, and I give Speaker Johnson a lot of credit, and thank you for mentioning him, because he's still in political risk because of his bringing the Ukraine bill to the floor. But the idea is that Russia just can't take over its neighbor, and we've got to be there to help. But part of the problem was the way that it was done. We didn't get the Ukrainians the weapons they needed early enough. So that I don't like criticizing the Biden administration, and I've been criticized on the right for not criticizing them enough. The Biden guys criticized me for pointing this out, but every time the Ukrainians needed weapons, they got them too little, too late. It was they wanted F-16s. They can't have F-16s. They'll eventually get them. They want ATACMS, they can't get them, now they've got them. They wanted HIMARS, they couldn't get it, now they've got them. So the Biden folks didn't do a good job of getting the Ukrainians what they needed at the time they needed it to defeat the Russians when they really were in peril. So that's number one. Number two is America is the arsenal of democracy, and on the right and on the left, I think people can get behind giving military aid to the Ukrainians. But they want to see the Europeans involved as well. I mean, we can't care more about European security than the Europeans care about it. Now, the Europeans have stepped up lately, but in the early days, it was all the U.S. all the time. And it wasn't just that we were giving them military aid. We were giving them teachers' salaries, firefighters' salaries, government pensions. Now, a guy like Mike Waltz, congressman, is a great congressman, has been supportive of Ukraine from the start. He goes to a town hall in Florida, and teachers say, look, I'm working a second job because I don't make enough as a teacher to pay my gas bill and buy groceries for my kids. So I got to take a second job selling, working at the mall in the evenings because I don't have, but we're paying the salaries of teachers in Ukraine. So I think part of our job was to make sure that what the U.S. focused on was getting lethal aid, where we excel, getting the equipment and platforms that Ukraine needed, and let the Europeans come in and put pressure on the Europeans, not just be popular with them, because the Europeans loved it. It's like the U.S. will pay the aid, the U.S. will give them the weapons. We don't have to do anything. We can keep running budget surpluses here in Europe. And we had to make sure the Europeans stepped up, and I think that was part of getting this bill passed, was making it a lethal aid bill and not just a general Ukraine aid bill. So, but again, I'll compliment look, I want to make clear that the first person to get lethal aid to the Ukrainians, the Javelin missiles, which when the three-pronged armored axis attack started, what stopped it were the Javelin missiles that we got to Ukraine in the Trump administration. And the Biden administration didn't send any aid to Ukraine. Some people, I know Secretary Clinton wanted to, but the president decided not to. He didn't want to escalate against Putin. But we got him the lethal aid, and we got him also special forces training, which was critical. So with our SF operators on the ground training the Ukrainian forces and with the Javelin missiles, we blunted it. So again, I think this has been a bipartisan effort, and I'll give the Biden people credit for, once Ukraine was invaded, rallying the country and getting the aid that they needed, and also enlarging NATO. And then I'll also stop talking and give the floor to a lawyer. I'll never stop talking. But Putin went into Ukraine hoping to split NATO. He wanted to drive a wedge into NATO. He wanted to split off some of the NATO countries. What did he get instead? He got Finland and Sweden, two highly capable countries, join NATO. Long histories, hundreds of years of histories of neutrality. They both joined NATO, and NATO became stronger as a result of Finland and Sweden joining NATO and bringing their capabilities to the NATO side of the team. So Putin lost there, and I compliment the Biden folks for shepherding that through. That was not easy to do with Hungary and Turkey and some of the objections to those countries joining. So I think this has been, I think supporting Ukraine has been bipartisan. I'm glad to see that the votes in the Senate and the House are bipartisan. And look, supporting Israel and Taiwan are just as morally important to us as supporting Ukraine. So I can compliment Congressman Waltz and all his colleagues who got it done, and on both sides of the aisle.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you very much for that. Sean, it's important to talk about logistics and supply and all the ingredients that go into trying to support Ukraine on the battlefield. But in this conflict, like so many others, without leadership at the top, there would not be a Ukraine today. I mean, in my view, if President Zelensky had taken the offer made by the UK, the US, and others to seek safety in the face of what was a brutal invasion intending to try to decapitate leadership, namely kill Zelensky and the people around him, I'm not sure Ukraine would have survived. And I give Zelensky an enormous amount of personal credit for the way he's conducted himself and tried to, under tremendous stress, keep the country together, keep it fighting. But you were literally there. I mean, this is almost impossible to believe. I mean, you really are like a Zelig, Sean was literally in Kyiv when the war started. So take us back to that point, and the result of your being there and meeting Zelensky led to this amazing documentary that you did that both Karen and I have, touted as something everybody should see. But But explain what it was like, why you ended up there, you know, literally as the Russian tanks and air attack began.
So I should say that because these are the tricky part of the conversations when it's Robert and I, because this is what the Trump administration did, this is what the Biden administration didn't do. I'll find maybe ways to slip the counterpoints in as we go, but not immediately. No, I had got involved with Billy Smith, my partner, producing partner on it. He's here. Billy came to me. We had been pursuing a couple of very tough documentaries, one in Syria, another one in Turkey. And for various reasons, we didn't find that we were going to have the access we wanted to have. And so it tailed between our legs back in the States. And then Billy came and he said, I've met someone who's very close to President Zelensky in Ukraine. And this could be an interesting, sort of lighthearted, this is long before the Russian buildup, beyond that which had continued in the East since 2014. But it had started, so really it was a documentary about a comedian turned president and who had had a bad phone call with a former president of ours. And I did find him interesting and thought, well, maybe we'll do that. And so we started having contact with the president's office and, would we be able to find some kind of open forum where we could, get a real sense of him personally and learn about Ukraine and doing that. And then COVID happened, and it's that delayed us. We got to know the president a little bit over Zoom. And I had said to him, look, the kind of documentary I would have any value added in is the kind where you're going to trust me differently than maybe you would have time to, a journalist. So I don't want you to say yes until, I don't want you to submit to going on camera until we've met face to face. And I'll save you some time and just say that the timing ended up being that it was 23rd of February, 22, that we met face to face, no cameras. And he agreed that on the 24th we would start shooting this documentary. And we went back to the hotel to prepare the cameras and prepare our day of shooting and try to lay our heads down, and then the rockets started coming in. And we were very, I don't want to say happily surprised. I would say it was with all the heartbreak that was creating. We got this extraordinary phone call from the president's office that he was going to follow through on going on camera on that day, and that's what led to it. And then we went back about 7 times back and forth to collect what became the story of superpower. And Robert and Roger were the ones I was on the phone with, and they're saying he was a religious man, but he said something like, "Get the F out of there." Yeah, so that was the thing. One of the things, if I may, you could say in reverse order, the biggest threats to us, to the world, are nuclear proliferation, global warming, and number one, division. And division by extremes in both parties, in cultural extremes. And it's so easy to understand the passion of people at moments on certain subjects and that are very complicated and have very long histories. And I think that it's one of the things that Robert and I have tried to do. We've talked to veterans groups and so on, that there's a real temptation to indulge that passionate thought in a silo. But in the case of Ukraine, and one of the things from the beginning that we felt was really important to remind people of is the Budapest Memorandum, where we gave our promise, as did the Russians, that there would be not only no invasion of the country of Ukraine, which had the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and surrendered it with the assurance of the Budapest Memorandum. And where we are in a war that is not just our, we do need to press on our European allies, but we are also in a war that Putin has said out loud is against us, the United States of America. He calls Ukraine our proxies. And this is an active war on inflaming division here. And so much of the independent spirit that is being exhibited is really a sheep sort of infusion that's come from this Russian machine. So we are, in essence, in a war that the Ukrainians are dying for us to fight. And so this is why it's become, I think, such a centrally passionate subject for me. And I've been very lucky to have Robert as a rally partner on it.
Madam Secretary, if I can just jump in there. I don't know if you understand how personally brave Sean is. I mean, this takes a lot of courage. And Roger did a trip into Syria for us and went to try and get Austin Tice out and went into bad guy country. But Sean's been to Syria. When we wanted to get Austin Tice out, he immediately offered to go into Syria alone. When Secretary Clinton and I travel, we have the Secret Service with us, and we're fortunate to have the good men and women of the Secret Service who will take a bullet for us. But these guys went in alone. And when Sean was in Ukraine, I called Roger. I said, "Hey, Sean's in Ukraine. I'm out of government at this point, so I don't have all the intel that Roger had access to." And he said, "Tell him to get the F out." Started with Carstens. I'll say that. I was merely repeating it and passing that along. So if anyone from Salt Lake is watching, that started with Carstens. But the key issue there, and this is what I told Sean, is Zelensky was being targeted. They wanted to decapitate the government. They wanted to kill him. And so he's in the bunker. Who's with him? This guy is interviewing him. And so that's why I said get the F out of there, because he's with the guy that the Russians were literally, they had an airborne special forces unit that was going in to kill Zelensky. And this, my knucklehead friend here, was refusing to leave the bunker with him. So, and he also did mention he's been to the front many times in Ukraine. And if you watch the video, watch the documentary, which is terrific, and Billy did a great job on it as well. If you watch the documentary, you'll see Sean at the front taking risks that we would. This goes back to the hostage-taking issue, and we don't advise Americans to do things that they would get them taken hostage or killed. That doesn't apply to Sean because he won't listen. But the reason he's on the front line in Haiti and after the earthquake, and even now trying to help the people of Haiti, the reason he's on the front line in Ukraine, the reason he's in Syria, is he's trying to help Americans. And we don't always agree on things politically, but what binds us together is so much more important than what divides us. So when we worked together on COVID. Sean called me when I was National Security Advisor. We'd work together on hostage issues. We'd work together on COVID, and we worked together in Ukraine. And those are all issues that bring us together as Americans. And it doesn't matter if you have an R after your name or a D after your name. We disagree on President Trump. We disagree on plenty of issues. I always tell people he's my favorite communist. But I love Sean like a brother, and I'm sure he's taken more grief for being friends with me than I've taken for being friends with him. And but the point is, if we step back for a moment and look at the big issues, Madam Secretary, where the things that bind us together as Americans, and it's more than that. It's just members of the free world. So it goes beyond America. It goes to Europe and Japan and Australia and our close allies. And for the oppressed people of the world, because keep in mind, we're not enemies with the Chinese people. They're being oppressed by the Chinese Communist Party, who are a bunch of thugs. We're not enemies with the Russian people. We're not enemies with the Palestinian people. But we're enemies with their leadership that are bad people, and evil exists in the world. And that's why I still believe that America is the last best hope for mankind on earth. And we should be that shining city on the hill, but we're not going to be a shining city on the hill if we're fighting with each other all the time. So we've got to find the areas where we can work together. And I've been proud to work with Sean, but he's a brave son of a gun. That night in Kiev was a little nerve-wracking. We were on the phone all night, trying to get him out, and him ignoring me. We eventually got him to the border, and he was able to walk across, leave his car behind, and walk across the border. That's a good thing about being a film production company. You can just stick the production company with the car and the vehicle and all that sort of thing, and walk across. If it was the U.S. government, they'd say, no, stay with your car and bring it across and wait for 5 hours. But he got out, and Roger made the effort to have a State Department person go meet him at the border and get him out. So I appreciate that, Roger. But
thank you.
But Sean did some brave things for Ukraine.
I also have to echo what Robert said, is that, you know, we do want Americans to stay out of harm's way, but some just won't listen. So we just have to accept that. But he also, you know, produced this great documentary, and it helped to tell the story that needed to be told. And we, in the time we have left, I want to ask each of you just a couple of maybe difficult questions looking forward. And to you first, Robert. Do you have an opinion? I know you're not in government now, but certainly you have vast experience. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not NATO should offer some kind of path to membership for Ukraine now, and whether that would have an impact in a way that would, you know, make it clear to Putin that he can't outweigh us, that, you know, his attitude is, well, if you can't get into NATO because it's a war, then I'm going to keep the war going, and I've got more people, and now my economy's producing again, and I'm making a lot of ammunition. Do you have an opinion about that?
It's a very hard question. So Fogh Rasmussen, the former Secretary General of NATO, called me the other day to have this very conversation. What makes it difficult, immediate NATO entry for Ukraine, is that we have something called Article 5 in NATO. So if any one NATO member is attacked, all of the NATO members have to respond, or at least there's a council that's called together, and the implication is that all the member countries will get involved in the war. And look, as much as I can't stand the Russians and I want to support Ukraine, I don't want to see American men and women in uniform fighting the Russians. And keep in mind, the Russians, you know, I think Jim Baker called them a gas station with nuclear weapons. I mean, they still have 1,250 strategic nuclear weapons pointed at us. So the escalation with the Russians is something we want to avoid. Reasonably, we can't be blackmailed because they've got nukes, but we've got to be careful. So what I've recommended, instead of immediate NATO membership, which, you know, could lead to U.S. troops, and I've got two daughters, Lomer and I have two daughters who serve in the military. One was deployed to Poland recently, and the other's training to fly a C-130, so she'd be involved. Look, I don't want them fighting Russians right now. I think we can do, and the Ukrainians haven't asked us to fight the Russians for them yet, but so I think we need to avoid that. What can be done immediately is I think the EU needs to step up and give them EU membership. And I know there's a long bureaucratic path to EU membership for Ukraine. We need to give Ukraine EU membership immediately, cut through the bureaucracy, get it done. It doesn't involve a military commitment like NATO would, but it would send a very strong message to Putin that Ukraine is part of Europe, that it's going to be integrated into Europe fully, and he's never going to get a hold of it. So that would be my compromise. But look, down the road, I think NATO membership is fully appropriate for Ukraine, but I think that's a ways down the road.
Thank you. And Sean, last word. So based on literally your personal experience in Ukraine, your relationship with Zelensky, how do you see the short term and then maybe the medium term? Will this new supply of weapons and support enable them to hold the line with the Russians? Will you be optimistic about what they can do given the somewhat disadvantaged position they're starting from now?
Well, I guess I start with the missed opportunity, because I agree with Robert. I think that there was a time we would all remember at the beginning of the war when Ukraine surprised the world and resisted. And I think that whether it be Democrats, Republicans, Independents, throughout the Ukrainian flags flying in front of people's houses, and the momentum and I think a will to understand the reality of it was so present, and that was really the time where the country had momentum to supply them. So the question now is we have to see how the supplemental works, how fast the weapons get in. I know that there was some reporting that the president had found some other means previously, that things were beginning to move. I'm hearing there is prepositioned equipment in Poland moving. We'll see how quickly it gets to it. I've made the argument from the beginning, and I feel that there was far too much caution, that the likelihood of Putin using nuclear weapons was very low to begin with. And I think remains so, and I don't say that just as an actor from Hollywood with an opinion, but somebody who's had the access to the better minds in the room on it. Especially
you've
when
met Putin as well, haven't you?
Sorry?
You've met Putin?
I've met Putin also, and I would say the thing, by extension, is that, and President Zelensky speaks about this, one of the things about Putin that's, is that he's deeply uninteresting and undistracted by nuance. And so there's a sort of savantism to things that are not what we want to offer our kids in compassion, humanity, or even inventiveness. And so it would be very inventive for him to use nuclear weapons in a way that might impact trade throughout the world. The Russians, the Chinese wouldn't appreciate it, I don't think, very much either. So what's he got? And the war stops when the Russians stop fighting. And so what does it make to make the Russians stop fighting? I think it's going to take some stings on the inside of Russia with the long-range stuff. And the Ukrainians are so resilient, so in the fight, but man, they've been being punished for a couple of straight years. And so, what's happened has been miraculous. I really think that we have to renew our commitment to paying attention and to rallying strength to the Ukrainians, because they're still made of flesh and blood. They fortunately have this guy who, in that moment from the 23rd to the 24th, all of us that had the privilege of being in that room with him on that day, it was two different creatures. And he clearly, on the 24th, it was clear in his face, he'd been born for this leadership. But as is said in the movie, there's a national tradition of disillusionment. And so things do tend to implode from the inside. And so I think we have to help Ukraine not implode from the inside, and that they will succeed in resisting the Russians.
Well, let's give a round of applause and thanks to both Robert Rezaian and Sean Penn. Thank you both very much.
That's great. Thank you.
Well, this ends our afternoon of heavy-duty discussions about hostages in Ukraine. But I'm very grateful to IGP and the Knight Foundation for supporting first the Across the Aisle, now the Spotlight interview. And we look forward to more such incredibly important, impactful events. Thank you all.